Hannah's from Washington State and has a lifelong interest in birds. She came to Duluth to work at Hawk Ridge and is currently a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. She's worked for the Institute of Bird Populations, Whitefish Point Bird Observatory, and the Natural Resources Research Institute in Duluth, among others. So, Hannah.
Thank you.
In just a second.
I'm just getting it up. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and listening to us talk about research and birds that we're passionate about. It's really awesome to see so many folks. I'm going to talk to you about northern hawk owls and kind of go through some background info, but then get really into sort of their winter habits and movements that I've seen in my study. I don't have a great, bald eagle connection. I'm not bald, so I'll try to think of a joke as I go along. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is just some background on the northern hawk owl, some of my methods that I use for my study, some field season recaps from last winter, so that process, and then I do have some preliminary results that we'll go over, some next steps, because as Matt mentioned, I have not graduated yet, still got a lot to do, wrapping up my project, and then some conclusions based off of the study. So northern hawk owls, they are one of the least studied birds in North America. There are different subspecies. They're a whole Arctic species, so there are subspecies in Europe that have been slightly more studied, but they are a really sort of unknown enigmatic species in North America, and part of that is that they are hard to study. They're in really remote areas. They're a low-density species, so it's hard to monitor their populations. They have kind of some odd behaviors. They are hunting during the day. They do use eyesight and sometimes hearing for hunting, but that is why you see them sort of at the top of the canopy, on a black spruce tree or a tamarack, and they are out during the day. So not a typical owl or owl behaviors that you would think of. They are eruptive and nomadic. So what that means is, maybe there was a really big kind of booming breeding season up north, and then a year later, you have all of these hawk owls around, and a prey crash happens. And so, as so many of you know, eruptions, kind of cause a lot of species to go farther and farther south in search of their food. And so those movements, especially for hawk owls, are just largely unknown of how far they're going, where they're going, where those food sources are, et cetera. And we have assumed that they are nomadic, that they don't have sort of a typical annual cycle of migration, but they do move. So that is sort of a kind of unique feature of the hawk owl. And then just in terms of kind of looking at the literature, the biggest gap that we saw is that in the winter, and specifically looking at their movements and ecology, there just was not a lot of information about them. And a lot of that is coming from the Birds of the World account, and James Duncan has done a lot of work just trying to figure out where those gaps are and what research needs to be done. So I just wanted to quickly show you this climate kind of map that was done by National Audubon. So hawk owls are listed as a climate endangered species, and so kind of orienting you to the map, I don't really have a pointer, but on the left side, all of that in yellow is sort of their current range. So it sort of mirrors the boreal forests where hawk owls can be found, and this is specifically looking at winter, but we're looking at year sort of 2015 up until to the right to year 2080. And this is showing you if there's a 3% or 3 degree increase in temperature, what is happening to that range. So as you can see, you can't see my mouse. All of this in red is predicted to be lost. So that's 72% of the hawk owl range, which obviously is all of the range in Minnesota, which is terrible and sad. But then the range that's maintained is this little kind of yellow in between the red and the blue. And then that blue is sort of range that is gained. So overall, if we see that kind of temperature increase, they're losing about 20% of their total kind of range coverage. But a big question is that range that's gained up in sort of this area, what is the quality of that habitat? Are there trees big enough for them to nest in cavities? Are there, small mammal populations that can be sustained up there? So there's lots of questions right now of how organisms that are so dependent on forests like this, like the boreal forest, how they're going to adapt as our climate is changing. So just something to keep in mind for sort of why some of this research is important and why we're looking at these species where there's not a lot of information out there about them. All right, so some knowledge gaps. Like I said, really focusing on winter. So winter range, winter microhabitat. If they're sticking to a patch, where they're at, what does that microhabitat look like? And then we are going to be looking kind of a secondary component of this at winter diet. Just what are they eating in the winter? So some key questions, really boiling it down to three main ones. So one is, what is the range of northern hawkbills, and do they have microhabitat preferences? And this one I will kind of talk about more so than the other two. We'll get to those, but this is sort of my big main question. So to orient you to where this research was happening, we were focusing on northern Minnesota and southern Manitoba. As all of you birders know, last year was not an eruption year. This year is not really shaping up to be one, even though we hoped it would come. We are definitely due for an eruption of owls. But you can kind of see there's some sightings just from an eBird map, and the three kind of main areas we focused on were these big blue stars. Unlike some studies, this was very dependent on where the hawk owl was. So there was kind of a lot of work into trying to figure out where these birds were, driving around, looking at spruce trees, relying on people sighting these birds and reporting it to us. So if you did that, I really appreciate it. And then I was able to collaborate up in Manitoba with a researcher there who's done a lot of work on great grays and catching hawk owls in the winter. So I was able to extend my study up into Canada. So a little bit about how this project came to be. There was no information on sort of the movements of hawk owls, especially in the US. There was one study back in the 80s in Finland of using some VHF, some hand tracking telemetry units off of nests for hawk owls, but there had never been a hawk owl that had received a satellite or cellular transmitter. So we kind of, in collaboration with Frank Nicoletti and some folks at Cellular Tracking Technologies, kind of trying to talk through what technology would be possible to put on these birds that are a medium-sized owl, they're not super big, that potentially could survive super cold temperatures and give us high-resolution data to look at these winter movements. So I talked with a lot of researchers from Project Snowstorm, if you're familiar with that. They're looking at snowy owl movements. Talked to the Rough-Legged Hawk Project, the Red-Tailed Hawk Project, trying to just get an idea of, is this feasible? Will this work? Because it's never been done before. So it was nerve-wracking and trying to figure out what to do. So we decided on using these solar GPS GSM cellular units. So they ping off of cell towers, but give you really high resolution data because they're not having to travel as far to something like a satellite. We chose the solar unit because hawk owls, just in terms of their breeding ecology and basic life ecology, they sit up high in the canopy, and they're probably getting a lot of sun, and they're active during the day. So they were sort of a model candidate for using this type of technology in that way. This was sort of cutting edge. It was one of the smallest units possible. They only weigh 10 grams to collect this type of data. So what we were able to do is we collected data hourly, 3 days a week, for each individual owl. And it did work. I will talk a little bit about how it worked in a second, but there was success that we saw. So as you can see, just pictured, this is what the unit looked like. This is one of the first hawk owls that received the unit, and then this is just an example of what the data looks like, but I'll show you that in more detail. All right. So a little bit about sort of the field season recap. So this was last winter, 2021 to 2022. Steve Colby is just in so many of these presentations. He is definitely a big help searching for these owls. So for effort, we drove over 10,000 miles in just about not even 3 months. There's over 800 hours of volunteer effort. I did not do this alone. I had a lot of help, and it was really impressive to see sort of how much work went into that. And that's not even counting, the people out birding and finding hawk owls that are hard to find. so that is a big help too. 12 volunteers, and the conditions that we were in were really cold, as I'm sure you're familiar with as well. From -10 to -40 degrees, hard to figure out, once we find an owl, trap it, we don't want to increase, its stress, so we don't want, a lot of heat from a car to be present while we're putting on this unit. And so that was kind of a big factor to think about. You have your windows down, have gloves, trying to stay warm while the owl is not being stressed. And then, just driving conditions, snowshoeing, just kind of the effort that was involved in doing this project. So we were able to deploy 10 transmitters, 3 of them in Minnesota and 7 of them in Manitoba. The habitats where the birds were captured were primarily black spruce and tamarack bog, farmland, and deciduous forest. The deciduous forest was definitely a surprise, and there weren't too many birds found there, but there definitely were some birds that were more closely associating with deciduous forest. And we also collected for diet analysis 17 cloacal swabs, some opportunistic poop samples, and 1 pellet. So that was sort of just the recap of what we were able to do last winter. So in terms of just what results we kind of found in terms of the winter range, so relating back to kind of my first key question, is we found that the average hawk owl range was really small. So it was 0.015 kilometers squared, and it was kind of a big range between birds. This is just an example of 3 of them. The smallest one right here, it was just basically going between 2 different sections of forest, just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And it was a really tiny home range, which was unexpected. Thinking of a nomadic species, you would think they would be moving around to lots of different places as the winter goes on. And we did see that in some of them. This bird right here, 1.2 kilometers squared, that's about 300 acres or so. It was covering a pretty large area. But it was just sort of surprising to see some of these birds with these really tiny home ranges in the winter. So this was over a period of about 3 months that they weren't necessarily moving very far. These lines, or what these circles are representing, this is 60% of that range, and then 95% of that range on the outer circle. So just 3 examples, kind of small, medium, and large for hawk owl home ranges in the winter. All right, and then in terms of microhabitat selection, I do still have quite a bit of work analyzing this data, but we did find kind of 2 significant microhabitat features that might not be super surprising to you, but it was really nice to actually see this reflected in the data and seeing that it was significant. So snag density between some controlled plots and then the heavily used sites. I should back up a little bit and say I went out and actually surveyed these sites after the winter season and plotted vegetation plots through sort of their most heavily used area from the tracking data that I got, and then compared that to a randomized cardinal direction adjacent to that heavily used area, just to see sort of, why were they sticking to this certain spot, what the habitat looked like, and then what a control looked like in comparison. So snag density was important, and then the height of the snags between the controlled area and the heavily used area was also significant. Again, very preliminary, and I have a lot of work to do there, but I just wanted to share that with you. And then just quickly, sort of the percentages of tree species that were present. Not as too much of a surprise, but a little bit of a surprise, was tamarack and tamarack snags were 40% of the overall habitat where we found hawk owls and where they stuck around for the winter. I just, in terms of anecdotally, thinking of where people see hawk owls, and I see them on top of black spruce a lot. There's only about 10% that were found in sort of heavily dominated black spruce and snag areas. So I think there's a little bit of a sighting bias there. Black spruce generally are a little bit taller, and maybe that's when we're detecting hawk owls. But it was really cool to see tamarack being really kind of a big representation of the tree composition. Deciduous species lumped together about 20%, and then sort of open or farmland habitat was about 30%. So this is just showing you a map of sort of an example of what this movement data looked like, and kind of just breaking it down. The red dots. So each of these are an individual GPS fix, so an individual location. This was a female hawk owl, which we just got our blood sampling back because hawk owls, even though there is sexual dimorphism between males and females, so females are generally bigger, males are smaller, like lots of raptors, there's a lot of overlap. So in terms of trapping them and banding them and measuring their wing chord, getting morphometric data, you can't necessarily say this is a male, this is a female. So we did blood sampling and were able to tell definitively which one was male and female. So in red you have the female. That was that really tiny home range, just kind of going back and forth between like 200 meters apart. And then in blue you have the male. So in terms of time, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but it is just really interesting to see sort of how defined these winter territories are between a male and a female. There's only about 6% of overlap when I added up all the points between the two. So again, just really kind of novel information that we didn't know about this species before. All right. And then these same two birds, which was these were caught in Roseau, Minnesota, just kind of a little bit south of the Canadian border. These two birds spent their winter down here, but then traveled way farther than sort of I anticipated, all the way up sort of right next to Lake Winnipeg, just a little bit west for the female, and then sort of down here was the last known location for the male. So just a quick glimpse into some of the data that we're getting, and it's just really interesting to see how they spent their winter, but then kind of what their kind of movements after that period looked like. And fingers crossed, we were really hoping that they check back in soon so we can see where they are going to be spending their next winter. All right, so for the second question, we were just looking at kind of an overall question if prey kind of diversified for hawk owls in the winter, and we were specifically sort of looking through pictures, seeing what they were eating. This is sort of their typical diet, which would be a red-backed vole or a meadow vole, something like that. But they've been seen taking bigger prey like red squirrels. An ermine from the bog one year, which is still just really shocking to see. What an insane picture to capture. There was also evidence of a hawk owl scavenging, it might be kind of hard to see, but scavenging a lynx carcass in Canada, and it spent 25 days scavenging this carcass and defending it from magpies, which previously hawk owls weren't really known to scavenge, so it was really interesting to see that. So we're really questioning if maybe they diversify their diet because of the severe conditions to birds. So right now we have some of that prey DNA that is going to be analyzed, and hopefully by May, when I plan to graduate, I will have that information for you. Lastly, and this is just the process for how to look at prey DNA. It's really similar to one of Matt's past grad students, Lisa, using metabarcoding to do that process. But for the sake of time, we'll continue. So lastly, kind of the culminating part of my project is asking if we can create a species distribution model that can accurately predict where these hawk owls might be, so their presence. Thank you. So this is just an idea of how I will be putting this together. I'll be using some eBird data for some larger kind of maps showing these predictions, and then my tracking data, kind of using that with environmental data, plugging it into a model, and then hopefully producing a predictive map, figuring out, if we change these environmental factors, where will hawk owls be in the future? So we've done some preliminary modeling and found that habitat type, snag density, temperature, and snow depth are all really important features for hawk owls, and so we'll be looking more in detail kind of what that means for their next steps. All right, so what I will be doing in the months to come is analyzing those prey DNA samples. I'm going to be analyzing those map movements and getting some more definitive numbers based off of what those movements look like, creating that model, trying to figure out where hawk owls will be under those changing environmental conditions. And then I plan to deploy 2 more transmitters, hopefully in the Zaxton Bog, again, hoping those hawk owls show up this winter. All right. Conclusion, important to collect information on these birds. We found some really cool information. I've had a lot of help, so just really quickly referencing sort of my field support, who is out there with me in these conditions, my lab group, and then lastly, acknowledging Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory, University of Minnesota, and the Natural Resources Research Institute. And all of my funding sources, which I'm sorry I'm out of time, I would have mentioned, but you are all very important. Thank you. Sorry that was so long. Wait. It's only been 19 minutes.
There's
So
time for questions.
I'm okay.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty of time for questions, so if folks have them, we'll get a microphone to you. Again, name, if you have an affiliation, that you're asking a question from. Any questions? All right, there's one.
And while they're getting that, a quick shout out to MOU, one of my first funders, and I really appreciate your support.
Hi, Hannah. Annie Bracey.
Hi, Annie.
My question, you said that you were hoping that some of those birds would come online again soon. So how does that work? Like, how are you getting the data, and what's your expectation that you're still going to get more?
Yeah, great question. So through the technology interface that I'm using through cellular tracking technologies, their interface, basically I can see what the battery life is of those units currently. And so most of them have, a really good battery life still. If we saw that drop off, we would get that information. So right now I can just see that the GPS points aren't able to load, but I at least can see the information that the units are still functional. So through their site, I am basically just waiting. I check it every single day until those hawk owls check in. So that's sort of the process for how I'm going to get the data, just sort of clicking and waiting.
Awesome. One quick follow-up to
Yeah.
that. So if they come back online, will it backlog all of the points that it has been collecting?
Yes.
Okay. So you're
Yep.
not, that's super exciting.
Yeah, and I've seen that because I have some data from the summer that I haven't looked at yet. The last bird stopped checking in August, but it took 3 months for that bird to check back in, and I got all of that back data. So at least for that unit, it's working. Again, it's really new technology, so I'm hoping that we have that success and we'll get all of those data points.
Hannah, Mark Martell.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. So I guess I'm curious, the birds that you studied in the winter breeding in Canada, but I'm really superficial understanding of the difference between their breeding grounds and Roseau, Minnesota. Why are they moving down to northern Minnesota?
It's a great question. Yeah, so previously, because they are, eruptive and nomadic, their wintering ground and breeding ground aren't necessarily different. So it's sort of assumed that if they're in a location where there's food, they're in the correct habitat, maybe there's, a big snag, they're, a cavity nester or broken snag nester, they would just stay there year round. So it is a really good question to think about if their habitat in the winter is definitively different than in the breeding season. Because, there's definitely been no established breeding population of hawk owls in Minnesota, but there have been nests that have been found, almost every year. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say why they would potentially move that far. One very non-scientific observation that I have, or assumption, is that maybe these two birds that were in Roseau, Minnesota, that just showed up last winter, they were not there in the summer, as far as I know. Maybe they were siblings, and maybe they're moving that far north because maybe that's where they, were born. I have no idea. But it's really interesting to think about, why would these birds be moving if they don't necessarily have that migratory, behavior in terms of their evolution? So it could very well be that their breeding habitat is the same as their wintering habitat. Good question.
Thanks, Hannah.
All right. Thank you all.